Anton Mussert said he was a patriot. He said he loved the Netherlands. And he said he had nothing against Jews. He claimed he simply wanted to lead his country through the biggest crisis in its history. Unfortunately, he decided the best way to do this was to try and deal with Hitler. As leader of the Dutch Nazi Party, it would bring him to abandon his principles and betray his people. Because of his actions, the Dutch suffered a famine on a terrible scale. And as a result of his collaboration, the Jews in his country were systematically and ruthlessly murdered.
The Dutch just still don't want to admit, really, that a lot of them did things which were wrong. I just didn't know, really, until much later, how bad they were, some of them.
So why did Anton Mussert choose to side with the Nazis? Was he simply weak, naive, a dupe for Hitler? Or was he just an evil and pernicious collaborator? Anton Mussert was born in 1894 into a peaceful and prosperous country. Holland had not been involved in any major war for over 140 years and had been neutral ever since. From an early age, Mussert showed he had an analytical mind and studied civil engineering. He worked for the Utrecht Council, helping to design and build roads, rail, and canals. He was also a strong patriot. In the 1920s, he became active in several extreme right organizations. The emergence of extremism was seen as highly unusual in what had long been a harmonious society. But then came an event that would breathe life into his extremist beliefs. In 1929, banks and stock markets in New York crashed. The fallout spread like wildfire around the world, causing governments to collapse and businesses to fold. Thousands lost their jobs and began to starve. The economic depression was deeper and longer in the Netherlands than anywhere else in Europe, in part due to disastrous decisions by the Dutch government. With that government seemingly unable to cope, Holland's population sought out radical solutions: communism or fascism. Anton Mussert saw his chance. On the 14th of December 1931, he founded the National Socialist Movement, or NSB.
Die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Mussert's NSB was modeled on Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany. It shared the Nazi beliefs of love of nation, a willingness to work, and in strength of leadership. As Hitler was soon to be the Führer, or leader of Germany, Mussert wanted to be the Führer or de Leyder of Holland. Hitler had his brown-shirted thugs to reinforce his message. Mussert formed his own strong-arm squad, called the Mussert Guard. But the NSB had two key differences from the Nazis. It tolerated religion, and it was not anti-Semitic. Mussert even declared, "Every good Dutch Jew is welcome in our party." As the Great Depression sank deeper, Mussert sold himself as the savior of Holland. And he appeared to be hugely popular, addressing record crowds. Fear of communism was what drove most to the party. Mussert or Moscow became the NSB battle cry. The party membership grew quickly to over 6,000. Just 5 years after its formation, Mussert's NSB was such a success, it caught the attention of Hitler himself. Mussert was invited to meet the Führer in Berlin in late 1936. There he pledged his future cooperation in the fight against communism. Filled with pride, Mussert unleashed his party in a general election. But it won only 4% of the vote. It did even worse in local elections in 1939. The utter failure looked like the last straw for the NSB. But these would be the final elections they would fight. The Nazis would see to that. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Mussert thought his time had come. Seizing the moment, the NSB leader made contact with German military intelligence, the Abwehr, to discuss the Nazi annexation of Holland. He agreed to embark on a secret plot to kidnap the Dutch Queen, Wilhelmina. The man who claimed to be a staunch patriot was plotting an act of high treason. It would be the first of many betrayals of his people. But the plot was discovered, and several NSB members were arrested, though Mussert himself escaped and fled into hiding. But he wouldn't have to stay there for long. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany invaded Holland. Hitler's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, took the Dutch completely by surprise. 16,500 airborne troops were parachuted into the country. In the coastal town of Heemstede lived Hans Oppenheimer and his wife Rita. They had 3 children. The Oppenheimers were German Jews who had traveled to Holland via England in search of a better life. 9-year-old Rudy had no idea what lay in store for his family.
The Dutch were, of course, shooting at the planes. You could see these little puffs. In the end, you could see them hitting them. Those planes were burning, spiraling out of control, then sort of making a pirouette and dropping in the meadows which surrounded Heemstede. So with my friends, we cycled there to have a look at this, and we managed to get into the meadows and see all this junk lying there, really. We collected souvenirs, took it back to school, and had a great time. We swapped it.
The Germans made rapid progress, but faced pockets of stiff resistance, particularly in the city of The Hague and outside the port of Rotterdam. Rotterdam was Holland's second largest city with 500,000 people. Capture of its huge North Sea port was seen by Hitler as vital to his plans for the conquest of Europe. On the 14th of May, the Germans served the Dutch commanders in Rotterdam with an ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed. No reply was received, and at 1:20 in the afternoon, the bombers came. The Rotterdam Blitz leveled almost the entire city.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
"25,000 homes were destroyed. 80,000 were made homeless. Rotterdam surrendered. The next day, Holland conceded defeat. Despite being married to a German prince, Dutch Queen Wilhelmina, fearing for her life, fled to London.
After a heroic struggle, my nation that has attempted everything to maintain peace is being overpowered by sheer superiority of force. But morally, we can never be conquered. Our spirit will remain unbroken because our conscience is clear.
With Holland now in his possession, Hitler needed someone to take charge. So he appointed Viennese lawyer Arthur Seyss-Inquart as his leader in the Netherlands. Seyss-Inquart had form. He'd been in charge of the Nazification of Austria in 1938. As a sign of his goodwill, he ordered the release of all Dutch prisoners of war. Then he dissolved Parliament and began plans to Nazify Holland. He addressed the Dutch people on the 29th of May, calling for cooperation of two Germanic peoples of the same blood. His aim was to unite the Dutch behind the Nazis. He then made overtures to the NSB. Anton Mussert came out of hiding and gathered his NSB supporters together. If Mussert was not actually prime minister, he was at least now the most powerful Dutch politician remaining in the country. Grabbing this opportunity, Mussert presented Seyss-Inquart with a bold plan. He suggested taking over Queen Wilhelmina's vacant role as head of state to become de Leyder of Holland. Seyss-Inquart treated the idea with courtesy, and Mussert was invited to meet Hitler on the 23rd of September 1940. Mussert presented the Führer with a plan to create a League of Germanic peoples in Europe. This so-called Nordic Federation would have Hitler as its leader, but individual countries would also have separate leaders. Mussert proposed himself as the leader of Holland. Hitler cleverly threw the ball back to Mussert by suggesting that first his country must embrace National Socialism and should be what he called re-educated. Mussert agreed, seeing it as an opportunity for the rebirth of his beloved Holland. It was the first time that the Nazis would take advantage of Mussert's naivety. Mussert held a series of NSB rallies asking the Dutch people to follow him. He told them he would be their leader and promised them a safer, stronger Holland.
Dutch people, my people, and I repeat the words of their hopes, to knock on Hitler's door and ask for a place in the new Europe. A Europe controlled by Hitler and Mussolini, a place according to their virtues and their abilities.
Mussert appeared to be getting what he wanted, but then the true face of Nazism was revealed. The Germans started to turn on Dutch Jews. In 1940, there were over 150,000 Jews living peacefully in Holland. The Germans had to move slowly, but gradually they imposed their will. They began by issuing the entire population with identity cards detailing their racial background. Then all Jews were dismissed from government jobs and banned from public places.
We couldn't use public transport anymore. We couldn't buy in normal shops. We had to buy in the Jewish shops, which would only open for 2 hours a day. We also had a curfew. It was pretty rotten to be a Jew, really. The worst, I suppose, was being home, to have to be in your flat at 8 o'clock in the evening in the summer.
In Amsterdam, Dutch collaborators assaulted Jews in the street. But the Jews fought back, and when a Dutch Nazi was killed, the reprisal was swift. 400 Jewish men were snatched off the street and disappeared. Mussert, the self-styled leader, was outraged. He'd promised his people he'd protect them. Now they were being persecuted. There was nothing he could do. So in protest, thousands marched through the center of Amsterdam. It was the first sign that his authority was waning. For 48 hours, the workers of the city went on strike in support of the Jews. But the Germans didn't care. They shot and killed 9 of the strikers. Fearing a bloodbath, the protest was abandoned. But faced with such opposition, the Germans hardened their approach. They sealed off the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, turning it into a ghetto. Within just a few months, Mussert's promise to protect his people was already ringing hollow. But his promise to re-educate his country was also ringing hollow to the Nazis. They thought the demonstrations showed that Mussert lacked the stomach for a fight. So Seyss-Inquart began to undermine Mussert by favoring other NSB members. The head of the Netherlands Bank was Rost von Tonningen. He was a supporter of Nazification, even wishing to see the Dutch language replaced with German. He was an unpredictable, rabid anti-Semite, and he frightened even Mussert. Seyss-Inquart now appointed von Tonningen as a co-leader of the NSB. With his position as NSB leader under threat, Mussert changed his moderate view on Jews. He agreed to expel Jews from the NSB and then launched a Jews Not Wanted campaign. It was yet another betrayal of his people. His dangerous game with the Nazis had taken a new, darker direction. And then came an opportunity to ingratiate himself with Hitler once again. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Mussert thought that Holland might ride on the back of Hitler's conquests, so he offered the Nazis his assistance. He launched a recruitment drive for young men to join a Dutch legion and fight for Germany.
Auf dem Marsch zum Bahnhof.
The legion was first sent to Germany for training. Then almost 3,000 were ordered to the Eastern Front at Stalingrad. They fought with courage and distinction, but suffered terrible losses. It would cause deep resentment in Holland. Mussert then made another attempt to win back credibility by making a bold power play. He requested a further meeting with Hitler, at which he publicly swore an oath. He declared, "I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, as Germanic Führer, loyalty unto death, so help me God." In return, he'd asked to be installed as the Deputy Führer of the entire German Reich. Hitler refused, but Mussert's position was then undermined again by events on the other side of the world. The Dutch East Indies colony, modern-day Indonesia, was the jewel in the Dutch imperial crown.
Further evidence of the development of the Netherlands East Indies. A typical washing day scene in Batavia canals goes side by side with a busy scene in the harbour. And in the towns, there were fine modern buildings vying with beautiful examples of old Dutch architecture.
The Dutch East Indies was also a huge producer of oil. Japan, the Nazis' allies, had no oil of its own, and it was just waiting for an excuse to invade. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, and the US declared war on Japan. In response, Queen Wilhelmina also declared war on Japan. This gave the Japanese the excuse they needed. 9 days later, Japanese forces invaded the Dutch East Indies.
These then were the islands which acted as a magnet to the greedy little men of Nippon. And with the fall of Singapore, they advanced swiftly upon Java and Sumatra.
The Dutch rose up and set the country's oil stores ablaze to prevent the Japanese getting their hands on them. But it was hopeless. By March 1942, the Japanese had overrun the islands. 2,000 Dutch were killed and 60,000 captured. Mussert begged his Nazi friend to stop the Japanese. But Hitler ignored him. For Mussert, it was another disaster. His own citizens had been slaughtered by Hitler's allies. Mussert's promise to protect his people had been completely undermined. With Mussert humiliated by Hitler, his rivals in the NSB moved against him. Soon after invasion, the Germans set up an arm of their security police, the Dutch SS. It even incorporated the Mussert Guard. Its head, one of Mussert's principal lieutenants, was Hendrik Feldmayer. Now, under pressure from the Nazis, Feldmayer demanded his men take their future orders from Hitler. Mussert reluctantly agreed. So on the 17th of May 1942, 600 Dutch SS swore an oath of allegiance not to Holland, but Hitler. It was even renamed the Germanic SS in the Netherlands, and soon they would become involved in the Nazis' most terrible crime. Of all the Nazi-occupied countries of Western Europe, the Netherlands had the highest proportion of Jews. Consequently, it was there that the Nazi solution to the Jewish problem was most drastic. In June 1942, the roundup began. For the Jews, there was no way out. The country was surrounded by hostile territory. there was nowhere to run. They were trapped.
Before we moved to Amsterdam in April '42, they introduced this Jewish star. You know, I had to wear a Jewish star. And here you can see one of my stars, which I wore. The star always had to be visible on the left-hand side, so you had lots of them. You had one on your coat, one on your blazer, one on your pullover, one on your shirt. Whenever you took anything off, it was still visible. But we didn't mind really wearing them at the time, because I recall we had the craze in those days that kids liked wearing as many badges as possible.
Of course, 10-year-old Rudy Oppenheimer had no idea that the star was a way for the Nazis to identify their victims. Most of the rounding up of Jews was carried out by the Dutch SS. That included the old Mussert Guard. The Jews were sent to the Westerbork camp in northern Holland. Ironically, the Dutch government had built Westerbork as a refugee camp to house Jews escaping from Nazi Germany. It had even been built with Dutch Jewish money. It now became the main route to extermination. There was a railway line that ran directly to the Auschwitz and Sobibor death camps in Poland. In just 1 month, 11,000 were taken to the death camps. The rounding up and the transportations took place with Mussert's knowledge. All he requested was that former Jewish members of the NSB be spared. Even that was refused. Rounding up Jews was a lucrative business. One Dutch group, the Henneke column, took full advantage. Led by a Dutch mechanic, Wim Henneke, this special unit of 35 men, many of whom were members of Mussert's NSB, had agreed to clear the homes of the Jews after they'd been taken away. As in all other occupied countries in Europe, the furniture, clothes, and possessions of the Jews were stolen and redistributed in Germany. The Henneke column would invoice for their work, and it didn't take them long to realize how to make even more money. They would become bounty hunters. For each Jew they captured and turned in, Wim Henneke and his men received 7.5 guilders from the Nazis, equivalent to about £30 at the time. These are actual receipts given to Wim Henneke for the delivery of Jews. This is for a single Jew, date of birth 4th of August 1897. The second is for a family of 5 Jews in 1943. The total received 37 guilders and 50 cents. The Henneke column were at their most active throughout 1942 and 1943, and it's thought they arrested between 8,000 and 9,000 Jews, including children. There is no record of Mussert doing anything to stop them. But the Dutch fought back. They began hiding Jews from the Nazis. The scheme was nicknamed the Onderdike, or underdiving movement. An estimated 25,000 Jews were hidden during the war. Most famously Anne Frank, whose diary of her experience would become one of the most read books of all time. The Schwab family from Amsterdam managed to hide until the end of the war above a nightclub called the Alcazar. Harry Schwab even filmed his experiences with a small camera. These pictures reveal the cunning nature of some of the hiding places. Behind a wardrobe, under the stairs, or other secret compartments. Mussert knew what was happening and accepted it all. But by now he was fighting for his life. His power base was diminishing. His people had been slaughtered in the Far East. And now the Jews in Holland were being exterminated. He made repeated requests to meet Hitler, and finally got his meeting. Yet again, Hitler declined Mussert's idea to establish his Nordic Federation, but did give in to one request. He agreed to appoint Mussert de Leider, not just of the NSB, but now of all the Dutch people. In Dutch, Leider meant leader. But in German, and much to the amusement of Hitler, it had a less gracious meaning: unfortunate. Mussert returned to Holland, his credibility seemingly restored.
En gij, mijn Duitse kameraden, tot u zeg ik u.
In February 1943, Mussert and Seyss-Inquart held a joint Nazi-NSB rally, where Mussert pledged renewed support for the Nazis.
Met die duizenden die daarin zit, dan zeggen wij Nederlandse kameraden tot u, mijn Duitse kameraden. Het zijn onze kameraden die daar zijn, en wij staan en vallen met hen.
In reality, Mussert's new position was just a sham. As de Leider, he'd have no political power. He would just be a consultant. But in the eyes of ordinary Dutch people, Mussert had now become the Nazis' top emissary in Holland. And despite being reviled by the general public, the NSB was still active. The Oppenheimer family were about to find out how.
We could see the German soldiers and policemen going through our road, and we also saw they left the road without having knocked on our door, because we kept on watching through the curtains a little bit. My parents, of course, always told us not to be near the windows, but children don't listen to that. And then suddenly, about half an hour later, they came back, and they straight away knocked on our door, straight to our door only, and took us away.
Rudy would take many years to discover who tipped off the Nazis.
And it was only when I came back after the war that the lady below us told me that her neighbors, who were living one house further down the road, that they were collaborators called NSB, Nationaal Socialistische Bond, which were the Nazis in Holland, that they betrayed us.
The Oppenheimers ended up in the Westerbork transit camp.
The camp itself, I keep on telling people, wasn't too bad, really. It's quite small. It's only 500 meters by 500 meters. We got enough food to live on. We played football a lot outside the camp. I went to school there. They had a primary school. They obviously wanted to keep the camp clean, so each week you had to take a shower. You had a special bath card when it told you to go, and it would be stamped off. But the bad thing about it is it was called a transit camp, not for nothing.
Every Tuesday, a train would arrive at Westerbork, fill up with Jews, and then leave for the long journey to the death camps in Poland. The Oppenheimers, so far at least, had avoided being on the passenger list. But how?
We had a blue stamp on our ID card in Westerbork, which indicated that we were an exchange Jew because my sister Eve was born in Britain.
A family was classed as exchange Jews if one of them could prove they'd been born in any country the Nazis were at war with. This made them a valuable commodity. Exchange Jews could be swapped for German citizens imprisoned in other countries, such as Palestine and the USA. Eve Oppenheimer had been born in London in 1936 and had a British birth certificate. It qualified the family as exchange Jews.
We didn't have to go because there was some sort of rule by the commandant, who probably got the rule from Amsterdam, from the higher authorities, not to send those exchange Jews away. So we stayed there for 7 long months.
The Oppenheimers would be excused being listed for transfer, for now. As the harsh intentions of the Nazis and the NSB became clear, the Dutch people started to strike back. The Dutch resistance, fiercely loyal to their Queen of Orange, launched a series of attacks on prominent Dutch Nazis. In February 1943, the commander of the Dutch Legion, Lieutenant General Seyfarth, heard a knock at his door. As he opened the door, he was shot twice at point-blank range. 2 men fled the scene. Seyfarth died the next day, and the reprisals were swift. The Nazis took 50 men hostage and executed them. Faced with more resistance, the Dutch SS leader Hendrik Veldmayer embarked on Operation Silver Fur. Veldmayer assembled a 15-man death squad with the express purpose of carrying out retaliatory attacks against civilians. They murdered 54 Dutchmen, including the highly regarded political writer A.M. de Jong. Mussert was horrified. He bitterly opposed their actions and expelled Veldmayer from the NSB. He then demanded a further meeting with the Führer. But by now, Hitler had other things on his mind. In the Soviet Union, the German army was in full retreat. 100,000 men had been captured in Stalingrad. In North Africa, the British and American forces had Rommel's Afrika Korps surrounded. And the Americans were winning the war in the Far East. Hitler ordered the redoubling of the war effort. On the 18th of February, head of Nazi propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, called for total war.
Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
The Nazis ordered all Dutch soldiers whom they'd captured in 1940 to switch sides and report for duty in the Dutch Legion. Dutch workers responded by downing tools again and refusing to work for the Third Reich. This unprecedented strike led to the deaths of 80 by firing squad. Mussert was witnessing his country spiraling out of control. He'd lost command of his police. 100 NSB members had been assassinated, and thousands of men had died on the Eastern Front. On the 4th of December 1943, Mussert, his reputation in tatters, had his last meeting with Hitler. Hitler told him that he would never be granted any political power. Mussert and his NSB were totally isolated. Detested at home, rejected by Hitler. And all this time, the Nazis' murder machine was still operating. On the 31st of January 1944, the Oppenheimer family's luck ran out. They were on the dreaded transport list and reported to the railway siding, fearing the worst.
Well, in the end, it was our turn to go because on a Monday afternoon, they pushed the train into the camp again, as usual. But it was an ordinary train with seats.
They weren't to be taken to Auschwitz after all. In fact, all exchange Jews were being relocated to a very different camp in Germany.
At 3 o'clock we left, and then the rumor went round in the train we would go to Germany, to a place called Bergen-Belsen.
Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp. It had been a prison for enemies of the state, but now it was being used to detain exchange Jews.
We suddenly saw a very high double barbed wire fence. On the fence we noticed there were boards in German every 100 meters that if you get too close to the fence they would shoot you without any warning. Around the fence we could see now these real watchtowers, which you never had in Westerbork, with searchlights and machine guns. It was called the exchange camp, since we were exchange Jews.
But this was the end of their preferential treatment.
Schooling was forbidden in Belsen, playing was forbidden in Belsen, entertainment, which we had in Westerbork, was forbidden. I think everything was forbidden, and we just worked 6.5 days a week.
But it seemed freedom was not far away. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies opened the Western Front. On D-Day, British, American and Canadian troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. With them, a 1,500-strong brigade made up of Dutch soldiers who'd fled Holland in 1940. Even now, with the Allies closing in and with Mussert rejected by Hitler, he rallied his few remaining supporters and begged them to carry on fighting for Holland. The fight was soon on their doorstep. On the 13th of September, the first Dutch city, Maastricht, in the south of the country, was liberated by the Americans. And when BBC Radio Orangi prematurely reported the liberation of the southern town of Breda, thousands of NSB members fled to Germany. But Mussert stayed to face the music. Across much of the country, the Dutch began celebrating wildly, believing they too would soon be free. But a tragedy was just around the corner. Just 4 days later, Operation Market Garden was launched by the Allies. The plan was to grab key bridges across the rivers Meuse and Rhine and cut off the Ruhr, the German industrial heartland. Over 40,000 airborne troops were dropped, and the bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven were taken. Queen Wilhelmina expected a swift Allied victory, and in support called for a national rail strike to coincide with Market Garden and cut off supplies to the German army. Railway workers walked out, bringing the Dutch rail network to a halt. But the Queen's optimism was premature. The British Army found the crossing at Arnhem a bridge too far. They were defeated, and the Germans wanted revenge. They cut off supplies of coal, gas, electricity, food, and water. Shops ran out of food. Stoves and fires burnt out. The Dutch scavenged what they could. It marked the beginning of one of the worst human tragedies of the war. As the Allies counterattacked, the retreating Germans blew up dikes, holding back the North Sea. Fearing the whole of Holland might be flooded, the Allies held back their final assault. The Nazis would not retreat, and the Allies could not advance. The stalemate left the Dutch in the west of Holland cut off, freezing and starving. The Dutch would later brand the coming months the Hunger Winter. This famine claimed the lives of 16,000, who died of starvation and the cold. Caught up in it was a severely malnourished 15-year-old ballerina who spent the winter eating flour from crushed tulip bulbs to stay alive and dancing to raise money for the resistance. Audrey Hepburn would survive the war, but would blame the famine for chronic illness suffered later in her life. All the while his people starved, Anton Mussert did nothing. Eventually it was the Allies who brought an end to their suffering.
The Germans had agreed to complete immunity for Allied planes in 10 dropping zones from 700 hours to 1,500 hours daily. However, some bomber crews noted rifle and light anti-aircraft fire. In contrast to the days when Nazi planes brought destruction to Rotterdam, Allied planes were now bringing Dutch cities sustenance.
The RAF and the Americans dropped 11,000 tons of food. But conditions remained desperate for the Oppenheimer family inside the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Typhus had broken out, claiming the life of 15-year-old Anne Frank.
The Germans decided to bring the first survivors from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and more of those people came, and our camp became now overcrowded. We got lice, we got typhus, and now, of course, all these weak people started to die. Now my mum got ill, and she was put in a hospital barrack. But of course, by that time, there was chaos in the camp. There were no longer doctors or medicine or anything like that. A woman told me and the rest of the family that my mum had died. And of course, we were very upset about that. But then a few weeks later, my dad got ill, and he was put in a hospital barrack. And again, we visited him daily. But when we arrived there on the 20th of March, 1945, he was no longer lying in a bunk bed, and the guy who was lying there told me my dad had died.
By the spring of 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. Suddenly, Rudy, his brother and sister, were ordered out of the camp and onto another train. They were kept on the move so they might be traded for German prisoners of war. If only they'd stayed a few more days.
I gathered that 5 days after we left the railway ramp, we left it on the 10th of April 1945, the British Army entered the camp and liberated it. But of course I wasn't there anymore.
From every corner of Europe, German troops are making the long trek back to the remains of their Third Reich. This contingent marches through Holland, whose people have felt the full weight of the Nazi jackboot.
On the 5th of May 1945, the commander of 117,000 German troops in Holland surrendered. The German army threw down their guns and marched home. Queen Wilhelmina returned to her country to rapturous crowds.
In every Scheldt town where bitter battles raged a few months ago, the people gathered to welcome their queen. Here, where the grey winter's war left scars, the queen talks to the humble people who never stopped fighting for their liberty.
After the victory came the reprisals. In Holland, over 120,000 were arrested for collaborating with the Nazis. Hundreds of women were beaten, had their heads shaved, and even painted orange for having relationships with Nazi soldiers. Men who'd fought with the Dutch SS were made to clear minefields. Anton Mussert was arrested on the 7th of May and charged with high treason. He was brought to a special court for trial at The Hague in November. And after just 2 days was found guilty and sentenced to death. Having lost an appeal, Mussert begged the Queen for clemency. She refused, and exactly a year to the day after his arrest, he was executed by firing squad. So what are we to make of Anton Mussert, the Dutch collaborator? As his country was invaded and its leaders fled, his defense was that he alone could be trusted to shield his people from the horrors of war. He promised to protect the Dutch, but he sent thousands of young men to their deaths fighting for the Nazis and was powerless to stop the slaughter in the Dutch East Indies. And having once openly embraced the Jews and their culture, he stood by as 107,000 of them were exterminated by the Nazis. In his attempts to reason with Hitler, he failed to grasp the demoniacal nature of the Nazi regime. For his failure to see the truth, he paid the ultimate price. Paul, Eve, and Rudi Oppenheimer were liberated by the Russians and were eventually found by their uncle and aunt. Had Eve Oppenheimer not been born in Britain and qualified her family as exchange Jews, it's more than likely all would have been gassed. Today, Rudi and Eve Oppenheimer both live in London. The story of Greece during the Nazi occupation is one of unthinkable suffering for its people. It was a time of terrible human sacrifice, heroic resistance, and collaboration. At the heart of the story was one man, Ioannis Rallis, who led a puppet government installed by Adolf Hitler to do the Nazis' bidding. Rallis claimed he worked with the Nazis for one all-important reason: to prevent Greece from falling into the hands of communists. He even set up a brutal terror group, known as the Security Battalions, to hunt the communists down. But instead of saving Greece, he stood by as tens of thousands of Jews were deported to death camps. Whole villages were wiped out, and a devastating famine destroyed 1/10 of the country's population. So what is the truth about Ioannis Rallis? Was he a patriot who was trying to defend his people from what he thought was a greater evil? Was he a well-intentioned man who just got it wrong? Or was he a malicious collaborator?
He made a very strange kind of decision to collaborate with the German forces. He was an anti-communist to the point of collaboration.
At 61, Ioannis Rallis was already in his twilight years at the outbreak of war. The son of a former Greek prime minister, he came from a family with a long tradition in political leadership. A moderate and a patriot, he had served in several governments until 1935.
Rallis was a member of a patrician kind of family of politicians in Athens. He was a conservative, a royalist, He wasn't a fascist. He wasn't prominent in any way, good or bad.
Then in 1936, there came an event that threw Greece into turmoil. The country fell into a state of chaos following a general election. The Communist Party was on the rise, threatening the stability of the king, George II, and the government. So the king ignored the election and turned to a man who he thought could beat down the communists, Ioannis Metaxas. A former minister of war, Metaxas modeled himself on Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy.
Arriverà al benessere, alla potenza e alla gloria.
Mussolini's fascist party and its armed militia, the Black Shirts, had already clashed with the communists in Italy and had successfully defeated them. Inspired by this, Metaxas now introduced the fascist salute and a Mussolini-style national youth movement. He made it quite clear that his would be a staunchly anti-communist dictatorship. He swiftly declared a state of emergency and closed down the Greek parliament and pronounced himself dictator. Rallis, who had once been a political ally of Metaxas, opposed this lurch towards fascism. At this stage, there was no inkling that this was a man who would ever collaborate with the Nazis. But before he could do anything about Metaxas, events occurred that would change everything. In September 1939, World War II began. The German war machine blasted its way into Poland. For the people of Greece, miles from the conflict, this must have seemed another world away. But they hadn't reckoned on the man Metaxas had so admired, Benito Mussolini. Although seen as a figure of fun today, he didn't seem that way back in 1939. He had one of the largest armies and navies in Europe. And he also had a plan to recreate the old Roman Empire, an empire that included Greece.
Ha valicato le onde dei secoli e la serie delle generazioni. Vai agli inermi!
On October the 28th, 1940, Mussolini made his move. Italian troops invaded Greece, attacking the north of the country from Albania. Metaxas was horrified at his hero's betrayal. He rejected an ultimatum that the Italians be allowed in to take over the country. But as the invasion got underway, Mussolini had not counted on the Greek army. Lacking tanks, the Greek army decided to hit the invading Italians on the run, in the mountains. It gave them a distinct advantage. In just 6 weeks, the Greeks scored a decisive victory as they pushed the Italians back into Albania.
Cold steel and the sheer determination to win. These were the deciding factors. And here the hardy Greek mountain troops with their formidable bayonets came into their own. Well done, Greece.
The victory for the Greek military is regarded to this day by many as the first Allied victory of the Second World War. It was the first signs of a resistance that would become legendary.
Poor Mussolini has got just a teeny suspicion he's made a mistake, saying the Mediterranean was an Italian lake. What a surprise for the Duce. The Duce, he can't put it over the Greek.
To this day, the Greek rejection of the Italians' demands is still celebrated as a national holiday every year. Then in November 1940, the Royal Navy arrived in Greece bringing hundreds of British troops to support the Greek army. A declaration by the British government made a year earlier stated that in the event of a threat to Greek independence,
His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Greek government all the support in their power.
At first the British could only send a small force. Metaxas was keen to try and preserve his neutrality and not provoke Hitler. The British then added a number of Royal Air Force squadrons to the troops already in Greece. Their task was to help protect Greek cities, airfields and harbours from Italian air raids. Then, at the end of January 1941, Metaxas died. Churchill was now able to send a much bigger force to Greece. It consisted of 60,000 British, Australian and New Zealand troops. At this stage, Adolf Hitler had advanced plans to invade Russia. But having just seen his ally Mussolini humiliated, he decided to act.
Why did the Germans decide to invade Greece in spite of their plan to invade Russia or the Soviet Union at the time? Mainly because they were afraid of British aircraft stationed in Greece, that the Brits might and would most definitely bomb the oil fields of Romania, where the German forces had planned to refuel during their attack on the eastern part of the Soviet Union. I think that was the major reason.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
On April 6, 1941, German forces launched a blitzkrieg on Greece. The Greek and British Commonwealth forces facing the Germans were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. Battered by constant air attacks and with the Germans hard on their heels, the Allied troops retreated to Greek ports to await evacuation. Before leaving, they destroyed as much of their equipment as they could. The majority managed to avoid capture, thanks to the Royal Navy. For those of mainland Greece, the war was over. On the 27th of April 1941, Hitler's troops marched into Athens. But still, the country did not surrender. Crete, a tactically important island in the Mediterranean, held out. Tens of thousands of Greek and Allied troops were stationed there. So Hitler ordered Operation Mercury, the largest airborne operation yet mounted. It began at dawn on May the 20th, 1941. 10,000 elite German paratroopers tumbled out of their low-flying transport planes over the north of the island. Their key objective was the airfield at Malmö. but they met stubborn resistance. Then, after 7 days of fighting, Crete finally fell. "10,000 Allied prisoners were taken, together with all their heavy weapons. The Germans too had suffered heavy losses, more than 3,000 paratroopers dead or missing. As a German general said, Crete had become the graveyard of the German paratroopers, and a disastrous victory.
It was a bloody mess. They lost most of their forces there, mainly because the Brits and the natives fought tooth and nail to keep the island. The native Cretans, who used all kinds of weapons, including pitchforks, waited for the Germans when they landed and they slaughtered them.
Greece was now completely in the hands of Hitler and his troops. Its government had fled, and the Allies had withdrawn. Greece was now occupied by 3 Axis forces: Italy, Germany, and Bulgaria. The Bulgarians took over the region of Thrace. The Germans occupied Salonika, Corinth, and the Aegean Islands and Crete, and the Italians took the rest, including the capital, Athens. For the Germans, who now came flooding in, Greece was a kind of paradise. Many whiled away their time sightseeing. Swimming in the Aegean Sea became a popular pastime for the men and women of the German military. But the Germans also had a problem. They now had a country of 8 million people to run. With Germany fighting Britain in the west and about to invade Russia, they simply didn't have the manpower to rule Greece themselves. They needed a puppet government, manned by Greeks, who would do their bidding. Ioannis Rallis now watched as the first of a series of collaborationist governments was set up. The official line to the Greek people was that it was better to work with the Nazis rather than to continue fighting. That way, ordinary people could best be protected. But it was a claim that soon rung very hollow indeed. The Axis powers imposed what they called reconstruction fees, meaning that the Greek people had to pay for the cost of being invaded. As the Greek coffers were very low, the Nazis took payment in the form of crops and goods. Food and materials that should have been feeding and clothing Greek men, women, and children.
I think the Germans looked at Greece as a country that should be looted, practically. They tried to extract as much as they could out of this country, and mainly they looted foodstuff, and therefore deprived the population from basic foodstuff.
The lack of food was made even worse by the Allies. They were blockading Greece to starve out the Axis forces. The result became known as the Great Famine. As winter closed in, Greeks living in the cities found they couldn't get food. People were reduced to scavenging in bomb sites for anything to eat.
The winter of 1942 was absolutely disastrous. People just dropped in the streets. I remember my parents were telling me that they went to church one day and the church had this strange odor. And they realized that bodies were being stacked into the church and in a decaying state of affairs. And this was commonplace. It happened every day practically that winter. Something in the vicinity of 400,000 or maybe 500,000 dead was incurred because of lack of food.
As their people starved, the collaborationist politicians did nothing. But others did. Resistance movements began springing up, mainly in the countryside and the mountains. These resistance groups reflected the fractured nature of Greek politics. Nationalist, liberal, socialist and communist fighters all began vying for power. The largest resistance group to emerge was the National Liberation Front, the EAM. It was made up largely of communists and had its own military wing, known as Hellas.
The only organized force in Greece, organized in clandestine, let's say, activities, was the Communist Party. They had been under Metaxas's constant harassment. Many were imprisoned, and when the Germans entered Greece, prisons were, even before the Germans entered Greece, prisons were opened and people were let free. Many of these people who were once interned and were being under surveillance became the leaders of the new resistance force.
The main rival to the communist Hellas group was the right-wing National Republican Greek League, known as IDIS. The two rival groups clashed often as their ideologies went head-to-head. But they did at least have one common cause. They loathed the occupying Germans, Italians, and Bulgarians, and they would stop at nothing to drive them out. One way to strike a blow against the Axis forces was to attack their supply lines. Greece was a crucial route for the Germans supporting their troops in North Africa. Sever those lines, and it would be a major step in bringing the German war machine to a halt. The British soon realized that if they could get the resistance movements on side, it could prove decisive. So they selected a team from the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. They were highly trained specialists who carried out secret and daring missions. Experts in espionage and surveillance, their speciality was sabotage behind enemy lines. On the night of November the 25th, 1942, an SOE unit was parachuted into Greece. It met up with both communist-backed Hellas and nationalist IDIS fighters operating in the Greek mountains.
The British believed that the more damage the resistance forces did against the Germans, the better for the cause of the war. So they didn't really differentiate initially between left and right, who was communist or non-communist. They gave money to both sides, they tried to help both sides. In time, they realized that there was another war going on, and that was between the Communist Party and the other resistance forces.
Amazingly, the SOE team persuaded the two groups to work together. Their first mission was codenamed Operation Harling. Its target was the giant railway viaduct at Gorgopotamus. The bridge was part of a major supply line linking Thessalonica in the north and Athens in the south. Guerrillas from the two groups, along with members of the British Special Operations Team, attacked the viaduct and blew it up. The mission was a spectacular success. The vital viaduct was out of action for months. But it was the only time the two opposing guerrilla groups ever managed to cooperate. Italian and German troops were now sent out to put down the resistance. Their methods were vicious. For any Greek fighters who were caught, there could only be one outcome. Again, the collaborationist regime stood by and let it happen, as did Rallis. And the claim that they had only taken power in order to protect the Greek people would look even less convincing because of events elsewhere in the country. The city of Thessalonica had one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in Europe. There were 50,000 Sephardic Jews living in the city at the outbreak of World War II. For years, they had lived peacefully side by side with Greek Christians. But then the Germans arrived. Almost immediately, they began imposing anti-Jewish measures. Jewish newspapers were closed down. Jews were forced to wear a yellow Star of David. And Jewish families were forcibly removed from their homes. All the while, the collaborationist government did nothing to help them. In July 1942, all Jewish adult males in Thessalonica were ordered to report to the city's main square to register for compulsory labor. Deprived of any shade, they were made to perform exercises by their SS captors. Any Jews unable to do the exercises were insulted and beaten. And it would get far worse. In December 1942, the main Jewish cemetery in Thessalonica was destroyed. The following March, the city's entire Jewish community was crammed into railway boxcars, along with Jews from Thrace, the part of Greece occupied by Hitler's Bulgarian allies. A total of 60,000 men, women, and children were then sent in terrible conditions to Poland. There they died, in the gas chambers at Auschwitz and Treblinka. Almost the entire Jewish community of Thessalonica was wiped out. While the collaborationist ministers were guilty mainly of doing nothing, soon they and Rallis would become actively implicated in Nazi crimes. By April 1943, the resistance to the occupiers was growing. The Germans decided to turn to the one Greek they thought could help them deal with the guerrillas, Ioannis Rallis. He now became Prime Minister.
They appoint collaboration governments. The third was under Ioannis Rallis, a politician of the royalist variety, the populist or People's Party variety, who understood very well that the war was more or less ending at the expense of Germany, but he feared the takeover by the communist-led resistance forces. So his major, I think, concern was to prepare Greece for the post-war state of affairs. But he was nevertheless in cahoots with the Germans.
Rallis was right about one thing. By the time he came to power, the German army was indeed in trouble. In Russia, its army was trapped in Stalingrad. In North Africa, its forces were now close to defeat. It couldn't fight on two major fronts and deal with Greek guerrillas. So it asked Rallis to form his own army. And he did. Rallis set up units known as security battalions.
The security battalions were mostly thugs that would brutalize people who were considered friends or left-leaning people, or friends of the Communist Party, or simply disinterested in giving information, or shirked from giving information against their fellow citizens. So they were not well liked by the population, obviously.
Armed and trained by the Nazis, the mission of the security battalions was to liquidate the resistance groups in the Greek countryside. On the face of it, this was a patriotic movement designed to combat communism. And the security battalions did prove popular. 22,000 men volunteered. But any idea that they were fighting for Greece was quickly dispelled. On joining up, each member had to swear an oath of loyalty not to Greece, but to Adolf Hitler. Rallis objected to the oath on the grounds that Greek military forces couldn't put themselves in the hands of a foreign government. But he was simply ignored. By the time Rallis became prime minister, the communist-dominated Hellas had already gained control of a third of the country. Rallis was now in the bizarre position of being a Greek patriot, providing Greek soldiers to attack Greek freedom fighters. And Rallis's position would soon become even more invidious. For the Nazis would make him complicit in their greatest crime of all, the Holocaust. In 1943, the Jewish community in the capital city of Athens suddenly came under threat, right on Rallis's doorstep.
The Allied invasion operations began from the beaches of the Axis Sicilian stronghold. Operations which are now nearing completion, which resulted in the downfall of Benito Mussolini, and which will go forward until Italy and then Germany lay down their arms with unconditional surrender.
Ironically, it was a series of Allied victories that led to the Germans turning on the Athenian Jews. In the summer of 1943, the Allies had landed in Sicily. They fought their way up through southern Italy, and by September, Mussolini's regime had collapsed. Italy, in effect, now changed sides and joined the Allies. Hitler had to act fast. Right across France, Yugoslavia and Greece, German troops disarmed their former Italian friends. They now seized control of territories that had previously been occupied by the Italians. By the end of October 1943, the Germans had regained control over the Aegean, including Athens. Now the city's Jews lay at their mercy.
The Germans take over all the territories under Italian occupation, including Athens, and that is where the Jews of Athens are threatened with extinction because their turn would come with the Germans. The Italians were less severe in persecuting the Jews as opposed to the Germans. Fortunately, the Athenian Jews were old Jews. They were from Roman times. They spoke the Greek language and they were not distinguishable.
But still the Nazis stepped up the pressure on the city's Jewish community, demanding that the Greek authorities help round them up. Many Greek police officers simply ignored instructions to arrest Jews and turn them over to the Germans. The Archbishop of Athens and Greece, Damaskinos Papandreou, also defied the Nazis. He instructed his priests to get their congregations to rescue Jews. He also sent a strongly worded letter of protest to Prime Minister Rallis and to the Germans. Rallis himself was no anti-Semite, but he was caught in a trap, eager to work with the Nazis to defeat communism. He tried to tread a fine line. In public, he supported the Nazis' anti-Jewish measures. In private, though, he didn't punish fellow Greeks for defying them. It gained him few friends. To escape persecution, many Athenian Jews headed for the mountains to join the partisans. Others left the city by boat. Many went into hiding. But by the end of the war, around 800 Athenian Jews had been rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. But it wasn't just the Jewish population which was a target for the German troops that had taken over the areas once occupied by the Italians. The Germans now gave orders to crush the Greek resistance.
All armed men are to be shot on the spot. Villages from where shots have been fired or where armed men have been encountered are to be destroyed, and the men of the village are to be shot.
The Germans took heavy reprisals. It was their policy to do so. They would kill, let's say, 20, 50 Greeks for one German soldier or officer, even more. So reprisals was in line for any attack against the Germans.
If the Germans couldn't find the perpetrators, then they would turn on ordinary villagers. They would be arrested and publicly executed. These reprisals set ordinary Greeks against the resistance.
How does one explain to the rest of society that we kill one German and then we have 50 or 20, whatever, Greeks shot for that? Hence, we had many occasions when the Germans practically eradicated villages in order to make them an example, to set an example for other resistance activities.
In December 1943, the bloodiest massacre on Greek soil during World War II took place. After LS forces had killed 81 German soldiers, a German unit was dispatched to the town of Collaborators in the Peloponnese. When they reached the town, they locked all women and children in the local school. They then ordered all men and boys over 12 to a hill overlooking the village. There, the German troops machine-gunned them down. 696 men and boys were massacred. Only a handful survived to tell the tale. Then the German troops set about destroying the entire village, burning every building. Today in Collaborator, there is a memorial to those who were slaughtered. It's called the Place of Sacrifice, and the events of that fateful day in December 1943 are still commemorated every year. But if they thought these atrocities would stop the resistance, the Germans were wrong. The guerrillas kept attacking them, and the Germans kept burning villages. By the end of the war, hundreds of Greek villages had been destroyed. These attacks were a disaster for Rallis. What little credibility he had as a protector of his people was lost. But again, instead of saying anything, he just stood by and did nothing. By now in Russia, the Germans were on the run. In the west, the Allies had landed at Normandy. An Allied invasion of Greece seemed only weeks away. The majority of Greeks were looking forward to the day of their liberation. For the Germans in Greece, it was time to get ready for a last-ditch defense of the fatherland. This meant protecting the roads and railways, which they would use to withdraw to Germany. For Rallis, this could have been a time for him to have distanced himself. He could have resigned as Prime Minister and saved something of his reputation. Instead, he chose to continue his collaboration. He still believed it was his duty to destroy the communists. And for him, the only route to achieve his aim was with the Germans. In August 1944, the Soviet army burst into the Balkans, swiftly overrunning Romania and forcing Bulgaria to sue for peace. The Bulgarian forces in northern Greece immediately disintegrated. The Germans were now in danger of being cut off from their homeland. They began to retreat north. Along the way, they left a trail of devastation.
Well, the first thing the Germans did while withdrawing was to demolish everything they could demolish. They blew up all railroad stations that they could do so. They destroyed power companies, everything. So Greece was in total shambles after that.
Key targets were strategic installations like the Corinth Canal. Months, if not years, would pass before they could be used again. One of the Germans' last acts in Athens was to remove the swastika flag that had flown from the Acropolis. At the same time, the premiership of Ioannis Rallis finally came to a quiet and inglorious end. On October the 16th, 1944, British and Greek forces landed in Greek ports. Final proof that 4 years of Axis oppression and cruelty were finally over.
Carpets are spread in the street in front of the jeeps, and they are bombarded with flowers and fruit. Corinth, cleared of the enemy, receives with overwhelming enthusiasm the Greek and British troops.
The return of the British also brought the guerrilla groups into the Greek capital. Though they'd spent most of their time fighting the Germans in the mountains, they'd also been fighting each other, with the communist-backed Hellas jockeying for position to take control of the country after the war.
It's a rather complicated state of affairs because there were several wars being fought simultaneously. One was against the occupying forces by everybody, and then there was a war between the resistance movements for the future of Greece after the war. Who would take over the country after the war? Would it be a Republican regime? Would it be a royalist democracy? Or would it be a communist-led regime?
For 2 months, an uneasy calm existed between British forces on the Greek mainland and Hellas. But then early in December 1944, the one thing Rallis had been afraid of finally happened. Hellas forces rose up in Athens and attempted to seize control. It meant a new war, this time communists against the British. Churchill ordered British troops to crush the Hellas uprising.
Look at these pictures. British soldiers, comrades of the men who fought with Greeks against the Hun, are here engaged in fighting those same men. Airborne troops occupying a rooftop position fire their machine gun into a street of Athens to prevent the movement of Hellas forces.
Churchill went to Athens to oversee the creation of a pro-British government. The man he chose to lead it was Archbishop Damaskinos, who had done so much to protect Greek Jews from the Nazis. Now, a fierce battle began. The British unleashed a concentrated attack on the communist forces. RAF planes were even sent to attack their strongholds in the capital. After several weeks, the communist guerrillas were defeated. Archbishop Damaskinos and his government could at last establish itself. Order was restored, but it didn't last long.
A forward battalion moves up, and there goes the signal for the attack. Every type of modern weapon is brought into play as the bitter warfare surges back and forth over the desolate mountain passes.
In 1946, Greek communists once more took up arms. A fully fledged civil war broke out. It lasted 3 years and cost the lives of thousands of people. To end the civil war, the Greek government turned to the men who had served in Rallis's security battalions. They were released from prison to join Greek government forces fighting the communists. Eventually, in 1949, the civil war subsided. Greece remained free from communism. By then, Ioannis Rallis was a forgotten relic of the past. He was tried as a Nazi collaborator in 1946 and sentenced to life in prison. Rallis's defense to his people was that he was right to fear communism. The uprisings after the war and the lives they cost certainly seemed to be proof of that. But does fear of communism justify standing by when over 500,000 ordinary Greeks were starved to death? Does it justify supporting the Nazis' policy of transporting the Jews to the death camps? In terms of percentage of the population, Greece suffered amongst the worst of any country in World War II. Over 800,000 people, that's 10% of Greece's pre-war population, perished. And of course, in the end, communism, the thing Ioannis Rallis most feared, was defeated not by the Nazis, but by the Western Allies.
His driving force was mainly anti-communist. He was an anti-communist to the point of collaboration. That was his main fault. He ought to have realized that during that period, being an anti-communist didn't mean what it might have meant 10 years later. It meant that he made a very silly kind of, or strange kind of decision to collaborate with the German forces. And the German forces were the ogre. It wasn't anyone else then, it was the Germans who starved 500,000 Greeks to death.
It's hardly surprising, then, that Ioannis Rallis died in 1946, just 1 year after being imprisoned, a lonely and forgotten figure. Helsinki, Finland. The prosperous, confident capital of a prosperous, confident country. Much of this prosperity can be traced back to World War II, where this small country battled against the odds to survive and lay the foundations for its current economic success. But what you don't see emphasized on the war monuments is that for most of this war, the Finns fought not on the side of the Allies, but on the side of the Nazis. And amongst the prominent Finns that gave their full support for this was Finland's greatest hero, Marshal Mannerheim. The Finns justify this collaboration by saying that the alternative was to be swallowed up by communist Russia. But is this true? Was Mannerheim right to advocate fighting alongside Nazi Germany? Is it indeed possible to justify collaborating with the most evil regime in history? Could the Finns be that rare thing? Good collaborators? September 1939. War is declared. Germany and Russia invade Poland in a deal to split the conquered country in two and share the spoils. But in the north, Russia saw the chance to settle a long-standing grudge with an old enemy, Finland. Finland had been independent from Russia for just 22 years. Now the Russians wanted it back. In November 1939, Helsinki is attacked by Russian aircraft. "400,000 Russian soldiers pour over the border. At the start of what became known as the Winter War, there seemed to be no contest. The Russian forces massively outnumbered the Finns. Their generals confidently predicted a victory in 10 to 15 days. Finland, after all, was only a small nation of just 3.5 million people. 80% of their forces weren't professional soldiers, but volunteers. The Finns lacked key military equipment like tanks and had just 2 weeks' supply of ammunition. But Finland did have 2 secret weapons. The 1939 winter was exceptionally cold, which the Finns could use to their advantage. They also had a commander who knew the Russians like the back of his hand. Carl Gustav Mannerheim had served for 30 years in the Imperial Russian Army. He had then returned to Finland to lead the country to independence after a bloody civil war. Now this cigar-smoking aristocrat was back in charge of the Finnish army at the age of 72. It was Mannerheim's sure grasp of the tactics and strategy a small nation could use against a much larger aggressor that now would make all the difference. In the years leading up to the war, he had concentrated on building a series of trenches in the disputed Karelian Isthmus to the south of the country near Russia. Now those new defenses, which became known as the Mannerheim Lines, were being put to the test as the Russians advanced ever deeper. They worked. They held back the Red Army for a crucial 46 days of unrelenting pressure. And Mannerheim wasn't content just to defend. He organized small bands of soldiers, often lightly equipped on skis, who soon got the measure of the Russians. They used the terrain of forest, lakes, and wood to frustrate and trap the Red Army. This land may look beautiful now, but 50 years ago, it was a killing field. A favorite tactic of Mannerheim's was to trap the long Russian armored columns by attacking the convoys at the front, in the middle, and at the rear. The Finns then set about killing the remaining Russians in lightning attacks from all quarters. And if the Finns didn't get the Russian conscripts, the weather did. The fortunate were captured. Others froze to death. 200,000 of them. But despite these early Finnish successes, Mannerheim knew that the might of the Red Army would eventually win through. So in March 1940, he urged a battered and exhausted Finland to sue for peace with Russia. The result was a treaty in which it had to surrender much of Karelia, including its second largest city, Viipuri. "400,000 refugees fled into what remained of Finland. Many Finns felt betrayed, but Mannerheim stressed that their troops had done well, and at least Finland had not been conquered. But it was a very dark time, and it could only get worse. Mannerheim knew he needed help. The Russians were bound to come back. They always did, because Finland and Russia shared a long and savage history. For 100 years, Finland had been ruled as part of the old imperial territories of the Russian Tsar. Finnish independence seemed simply a dream. But then in 1917, towards the end of the First World War, imperialist Russia collapsed under the communist revolution. Finland became an independent nation. It was, though, too good to be true. The new communist rulers of Russia encouraged the Finnish working class to rise up and establish a Finnish communist state. Finland divided between the left, the communist Reds, and the right, the nationalist Whites. Civil war became inevitable. The Reds took over Helsinki and looked to Russia for help and support. The Whites regrouped in the country and looked instead for help to an old friend, Germany. After several months of very bloody battles, the white nationalists, led by the virulently anti-communist Mannerheim, triumphed. Over 80,000 Red sympathizers were interned, some in islands around Helsinki, in appalling conditions. 11,000 of them perished. The Whites had triumphed, but it was a triumph that was due not only to Mannerheim, but also to the German army, who in April 1918 helped take back Helsinki. It was a lesson all Finnish nationalists learned. Finland was free, and this latest Russian threat had been resisted, but they had needed German help.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Ten years later, the Russian threat returned. The Great Depression caused the financial meltdown of the whole continent. In the descent into social unrest and industrial disarray, Finland was not immune. Millions lost their jobs. Communism became attractive once again, especially to the working class and the poor. In elections all across Europe, the communist parties gained ground. In 1929 in Finland, they won 14% of the vote. Deep in the Finnish countryside, many were appalled. This rise in communism meant just one thing: the return of the Russians. Finnish farmers became the backbone of Lapur, a nationalist movement formed in 1929 dedicated to the eradication of communism. Its most prominent supporter was Gustav Mannerheim. After the Civil War ended in 1918, Mannerheim had retired to an elegant wooden house in the most expensive part of Helsinki. There he entertained and stored all the many trophies he'd acquired in his travels. Today it's a museum kept in the elegant style in which he lived. Although his bedroom reflects the soldier he always remained in his heart. But the rise in communism at the end of the 1920s persuaded him to return to public life and start hunting different kinds of prey.
He did not like the complete politics of the Lapo movement, but of course he did not accept the communist ideals, and that was the reason why he more sympathized with the Lapo.
Lapo persuaded the government to outlaw communism, but it then went much further, using terror and intimidation against anyone who opposed their vision of Finland. In 1932, Lapo was banned, but soon another right-wing party emerged, taking inspiration from Nazi Germany. The People's Patriotic Movement consciously copied elements of Hitler's political thinking, notably the national community, where the individual is secondary to the fatherland. Its newspaper called for a Finnish Hitler, and there was only one person they had in mind. For Mannerheim and Finland, it was a crucial moment. He had to choose between a Finnish democracy, whose weakness he despised, and a nationalist movement which shared his hatred of communism, but also was close to an ideology he feared as much as admired: Nazism. Mannerheim chose democracy. He decided the best way for Finland to resist the Russians was for him to stay out of politics and reorganize and rearm the Finnish army. The Winter War of 1939 proved him right. The Finnish army's resistance had stopped Russia taking back all of Finland, at least for now. It gave Mannerheim time. Time to find an ally who could help defeat the Russians when they inevitably returned. But who should they turn to? Mannerheim's preference was for the Western allies, particularly Britain and France. In the Winter War, the British cabinet had discussed sending a Franco-British volunteer force. But the Baltic Sea was controlled by the Germans, and in the end, it came to nothing. The 12,000 volunteers from all around the world who did make it to Finland included only a handful of British and French citizens. The option of a successful collaboration with the British and French seemed highly improbable. There was, however, another option: Finland's old friend Germany. The only problem was that this was a very different Germany. It was now controlled by Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis had agreed a pact with the Soviet Union and stayed neutral in the Winter War. But everyone knew this pact was cynical, and Hitler started conceiving the idea that his Russian ally would soon become his enemy. He was determined to strike first by preparing in secret an invasion. One key to a successful invasion would be taking the city of Leningrad. And to make sure of that, Hitler needed the Finns. In August 1940, Mannerheim received a letter from Hermann Goering, the most senior of all Hitler's commanders, requesting permission for German troops to cross Finnish soil. Granting permission would open the floodgates to cooperation and collaboration. It was a crucial moment. Mannerheim's flirtation with Lapo and Finnish nationalism in the 1930s had given him a distaste for fascism, and he knew dealing with the Nazis would destroy his international reputation forever. Yet the Winter War had made the Finnish people weary and hungry. The country was collapsing and needed aid. Aid only Germany could deliver. As Mannerheim pondered his decision, the pro-German movement in Finland grew stronger. Particularly influential was the new rector of Helsinki University, Ralph Nevanlinna. Nevanlinna had made his name not in the world of politics, but in mathematics. In the 1920s, he developed what is still known today as Nevanlinna theory, a major contribution to function theory, the classical mathematics which emerged from the calculus of Newton and Leibniz.
In the first half of the 20th century, he was certainly one of the most famous mathematicians in the world.
In the 1930s, Nevanlinna's interests turned to politics and nationalism. He supported Le Poor. And in Germany, the center of world mathematics and the country where his mother was born, he looked approvingly at the rise of Hitler and National Socialism.
Well, he sympathized it. He had many relatives in Germany because of his mother. So uncles and so close relatives. And their reports were positive. So I think he was happy to see the rise of Germany.
Nevanlinna traveled frequently to Germany, supporting academic events and conferences organized by the Nazi government. He became known as a sympathetic friend of the Third Reich, openly praising their achievements and singling out Goering for a special mention.
He gave a speech in Finnish radio in the fall of 1940. He praised the German armed forces of their successes in Europe and especially Nazi ideology.
Although Nevanlinna's enthusiasm for the Nazis wasn't widely shared in Finland, it was extremely influential. It was clear that given a choice between Russian communism and the Nazis, most Finns would choose the Nazis. So Mannerheim did the deal he knew would go down well with his fellow countrymen and women. With his ally, the new Finnish president, Risto Ryti, the Finns would cooperate with Nazi Germany. The result was felt straight away. Ammunition, oil, coal, fertilizers, grain and meat flooded into the country brought in by German troops to enthusiastic receptions from Finns all across the land. Finland had made it clear that the Finns would not be collaborators with the Nazis, but co-belligerents, fighting on the same side against a common enemy, Soviet Russia. But the reality was more complex. There was a price which Finland had to pay for Nazi help. Mannerheim and Ryti had to make several crucial concessions to the Nazis that went way beyond co-belligerency and which stepped over the line to collaboration. They allowed Finnish troops who were fighting the Russians in northern Finland to come under German command. And amongst the 200,000 German troops that now moved into Finland, the Finnish government turned a blind eye to soldiers from the armed wing of the Nazi Party, the SS. The SS had been formed in 1925 as a personal protection unit for Adolf Hitler. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, it had grown into one of the largest and most powerful organizations in the Third Reich. SS soldiers swore personal allegiance to Hitler and fought unquestionably for his ideology. They were responsible too for many of the atrocities carried out under the Nazi regime, in particular, the Holocaust. There was no Holocaust in Finland, but German SS officers were allowed a pretty free rein to interrogate political radicals and prisoners, especially those who were Jewish. But it was the final concession made by Mannerheim and Ritti to the Nazis that would prove the most troublesome. The Finns agreed to the German request to recruit volunteers to join the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front. Amongst these volunteers was Konstantin Kandi.
Minulla oli tulossa niin kuin asevelvollisuusaika vuonna 1941 lokakuussa, mutta silloin toukokuun aikana selvisi tieto, että Saksaan armeijaa pääsisi palvelemaan noin 8 vuodeksi. Niin me emme tienneet sitä, että me joudumme niin sanottuja Waffen-SS-osastoihin.
Mannerheim and Ritti realized that providing soldiers like Konstantin Kandi to the Waffen-SS would not only be a great propaganda triumph for the Nazis, it would take them across the line from being co-belligerents, fighting the same enemy, to active collaborators. So they did everything they could to limit the damage and cover their tracks. The Finnish SS battalion could only fight against Russia, not against the other allies. Their recruitment would be done not by the government, but at arm's length by Finns like mathematician Ralph Nevenlina, known for their Nazi sympathies and who could be blamed if anything went wrong. And the raw recruits were described not as soldiers, but as industrial workers when they were sent to SS training schools. Not that the training left any doubt about their role.
Siellä kuri oli kova. Siellä joutui ryömimään yli aitojen ja aliaitojen ja ampumarata oli alusta lähtien kova panos ammunta. Konekiväärillä ammuttiin. Ei mitään paukkupatrunoita, kovia patrunoita. Silloin kun tämä pataljona sitten sai tällaisen niin kuin, valmis lähtemään rintamalle, niin silloin oli 15. päivä syyskuuta 1942. Pataljona oli kerätty niin kuin avoneliöön ja siellä vannottiin Hitlerille, nimenomaan Hitlerille, valaa.
Once they had sworn their oaths, they were then ready to take part in the Nazis' latest and most daring military plan, Operation Barbarossa. In August 1941, German panzers drove deep into Russia, catching Stalin, their former ally, completely by surprise. The German army was soon well on the way to Leningrad. And there was another surprise for the Russians. Up in Finland, Mannerheim seized his opportunity. He launched his own attack on Russia to regain the land that was lost at the end of the Winter War. With the Red Army preoccupied with the German attack inside Russia, the Finnish troops managed to quickly capture all the territory conceded. Even the battered city, Viipuri. But at the old Russian-Finnish border, Mannerheim stopped his troops and ordered them to go no further. Despite German pleas, attacking Leningrad was a line of collaboration he was not prepared to cross. Mannerheim realized that if the Finns joined in with the German troops who were attacking Leningrad from the south, they would become aggressors. They would no longer be able to claim that Finland was involved in a defensive war, simply to take back Finnish territory. But now there was another unexpected problem that the Finnish government had to deal with. What to do with the Russian prisoners of war and displaced civilians who now came under Finnish control? Unlike the Germans, the Finns treated many of them well, but not all. In the last few years, historians and journalists like Boris Salomon have started investigating what really went on during the period of cooperation with the Nazis. They're uncovering stories which reveal that this cooperation had its dark side, which in Finland has often been denied or forgotten, such as the treatment of prisoners, displaced civilians, and refugees when the Finns took over eastern Karelia.
Gab Lager, Internierungslager, das in vielen dem System ähnelte, das die Deutschen in den besetzten Gebieten der Sowjetunion installiert hatten.
In one camp in the summer of 1942, over 3,000 Russians died of malnutrition.
Der große Gedanke war ja, eine Siedlungsaktion vorzunehmen. Das heißt, sozusagen die slawischen Anteile der Bevölkerung zu verdrängen und durch finnische Siedler zu ersetzen.
After the war, several prison wardens and officers were tried and found guilty of crimes against humanity. But at the time, nobody cared. Not even Mannerheim, who was focused instead on how well the war was going. Meanwhile, 200 miles south from Mannerheim's Finnish army, now stationary on the Russian border, the Finnish SS volunteers were deep inside Russia, fighting alongside the German army on the Eastern Front. They proved to be magnificent warriors, often against the odds. They were involved in the savage siege of Leningrad, and they then fought for the oil fields of Grozny as part of Hitler's push to Stalingrad. The Finnish volunteers' bravery earned the division many German medals, but at great personal cost. Over 500 of them were wounded. 200 lost their lives.
Minun ryhmäjohtaja kaatui minun vieressä ja luoti meni tästä läpi ja en saanut häntä pois sieltä ja hän jää sitten sinne vihollisen puolelle tavallaan. Oberscharführer Repp, sen nimi oli. Alanne kuoli jouluna. Pentti Koivisto kuoli jouluna.
But although they were part of the SS, the Finnish survivors claim to this day that they never took part in any atrocities or war crimes, and certainly not in the SS leader Heinrich Himmler's most murderous policy, the Holocaust.
Ja samaten meidän pataljoona ei myöskään syyllistynyt mihinkään tällaisiin sotarikoksiin, jotka taas olivat sellainen ruma tapa, ikävä tapa näille koti-SS-osastoilla. Ja ottakaa huomioon, että näissä SS, jotka olivat tässä teloitushommissa, suurin osa, erittäin suuri osa oli Baltian virolaisia, liettualaisia, latvialaisia.
And this has been the accepted opinion in Finland for the last 50 years. But now these accounts are being questioned too. The Finnish soldiers were, after all, fully part of the Waffen-SS.
Also man hat also nachweisen können, dass also Waffen-SS-Einheiten an Mordtaten in Lidice teilgenommen haben und auch in Frankreich Menschen ermordet haben. Das heißt, es gibt diese Einstufung, nämlich kriminelle Organisation. Man kann belegen, dass auch Finnen, die im Raum Kaukasus gekämpft haben, durchaus an Tötungen teilgenommen haben. An Tötung, ich meine jetzt an Zivilpersonen.
Boris Salomon says that in at least one fully documented case, in Poland in June 1941, a Finnish SS soldier witnessed an execution of Jews. He thinks there may well be other cases. But this is strongly denied by the SS veterans still alive today. They say they neither witnessed nor participated in any such crime, nor did any Finn they knew. There was one man, though, who gradually realized the potential for disaster the Finnish SS division might prove. In Finland today, you can't escape tributes to Carl Gustav Mannerheim. Not only does his statue dominate downtown Helsinki, the most important street in the capital is named after him. And in the house where he once lived, alongside his preserved furniture, you can now buy your very own Mannerheim bust, a bargain at €25. But one event that is not recorded here is Mannerheim's 75th birthday in August 1942, when he received a very famous, although not entirely welcome, last-minute visitor.
He was never a friend of Hitler, and he didn't want to make close friendship with him.
But at the time, the Führer certainly wanted to be friends with Mannerheim, or at least make sure the rest of the world saw him as a friend. So Hitler insisted his film unit recorded every step of his trip to give Mannerheim his birthday wishes.
Aterrizaje en un aeródromo detrás del frente finlandés. Recibe al Führer el presidente del Estado finlandés, Ryti.
But the Führer wasn't here just for a birthday party. There were one or two key problems with the German-Finnish cooperation on Hitler's mind, which was the real reason he made the trip. He needed a deal. A deal which involved Mannerheim agreeing to move the Finnish army into Russia, helping the German army secure Leningrad. And a deal which enabled him to keep the Finnish SS volunteers fighting with the German army in Russia and not recall them home. Mannerheim relished his moment of power, even doing something people rarely did in front of the Führer. Hitler hated smoking.
After the lunch, he lit his cigar, and all the officers of the Hitler companions, they were quite pale when they saw that, but they couldn't say anything, and Hitler did not say anything.
Mannerheim could sense that the war was on the turn, and that things were beginning to slip away from Germany. He wanted out. So he insisted that despite Hitler's wishes, the Finnish SS volunteers should be recalled from Russia, and the men integrated into the regular Finnish army on the Russian border. That didn't please the Germans at all. They turned to an old Finnish friend. With German approval, Professor Rolf Nevenlina became chair of a new committee designed to win public support for the Finnish SS. He had regular meetings with the volunteers, made frequent visits to Berlin, and lobbied hard. But Mannerheim wouldn't give way, and eventually the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, recognized defeat. Today, I release you from the service to the Waffen-SS. I thank you for your courageous service, that you have provided to the glory and honor of your beautiful motherland in a German soldier's uniform. You have just as much contributed to the victory against your and our age-old enemy Russia and against Bolshevism as your German SS comrades. By the summer of 1943, most of the Finnish SS battalion had been recalled, although over 100 did volunteer to stay on and fight as part of German units. Many of the battalion that made their way home joined the regular Finnish army under Mannerheim, now in stalemate with the resurgent Russians. But extracting Finland from the SS was relatively easy. Much more difficult was bringing an end to the war against Russia, not least because there were still hundreds of thousands of German troops on Finnish soil. Yet it was clear that this collaboration with the Nazis had to stop if Finland wasn't to find itself on the losing side at the end of the war. As the Nazis started experiencing a series of defeats and setbacks, so the Finns began slowly winding down their confrontations with the Russians in the north. By the end of 1943, they were refusing to take part in any offensive military operations that might help Germany. The trouble was, the Russians had another agenda. As they drove the Nazis out of Russia, so the Red Army targeted the Finnish front as part of a new initiative against Germany called Operation Bagration. Within days, the Russians had pushed the Finnish army back and were heading towards Viipuri. Soon the Finns would be steamrolled by their arch-enemy. Once more, the Finns needed help, and the only possible help was the friend that Ritti and Mannerheim were trying to get away from, Nazi Germany. So they hatched a daring plan. In return for Nazi support, President Ritti gave a personal undertaking not to pursue a separate peace with Russia. But what Mannerheim and Ritti knew well was that this presidential agreement, while perfectly lawful in Nazi Germany, was illegal in Finland because it hadn't been approved by the Finnish parliament. Mannerheim and Ritti tricked the Nazis into signing an accord which they could get out of any time they wanted. Germans rushed troops and anti-tank weapons to the rescue of the Finns. And in June and July 1944, Finland fought one last epic battle with Russia. 150,000 Russians faced 50,000 Finns. In an area spanning 40 square miles, the two sides' artillery pounded each other relentlessly. The Finns were fighting for their country's very survival. But they held on. .600 Russian tanks were destroyed, many with German-supplied weapons. Up to 20,000 Russian troops were killed. The battle was hugely important. The Finns had proved to the Russians they were a force to be reckoned with. They would fiercely resist all attempts by the Red Army to conquer them, and they had shown that the price of capturing Finland would be far too high. Most crucially, the Finns had forced Stalin to revise his policy. He opted for a separate armistice with Finland, a unique concession that no other former German ally would receive. None of this would have been possible without German support. The deal with Germany had secured Finland's future. And now the Finns would repay the Germans by going back on what they had promised. They claimed that they weren't bound by President Risto Riti's personal agreement not to agree a separate peace with Russia, because Ryti hadn't got Parliament's support and so had acted illegally. Ryti resigned. Mannerheim took over as president and was able to negotiate a separate peace between Finland and Russia without reference to Germany. Just as Mannerheim and Ryti had planned months before, the Nazis were now out in the cold. Finland may have lost the war, but it had survived. True, the Russians did insist on keeping all the territory they had won in the Winter War, including Viipuri, Finland's second city, now known as the Russian city of Viborg. But Finland, unlike the other Baltic states, remained free of communism. There was, however, a price to pay. In Helsinki today, there is a memorial for President Risto Ryti, who is now seen as a hero. But in 1946, he was the fall guy. A liberal economist who was a great admirer of Britain and America, Ryti was imprisoned by the Allies for 10 years in the trials which Russia demanded as a price of peace. His health never recovered. Other collaborators were much more fortunate. The mathematician and Nazi sympathizer Rolf Nevenlina had to resign as rector of Helsinki University. But then, like the other Finnish intellectuals who backed the Nazis, he was left alone by the Russians. He took up a lucrative professorship in Switzerland, and in the 1950s became one of Finland's most revered public figures. His reputation remains virtually unblemished today. The The reputation of Carl Gustav Mannerheim has, if anything, increased. Although just as guilty as Ritti in cooperating with the Nazis, his national popularity meant that it was too difficult for the Russians to put him on trial. He escaped any retribution whatsoever. After resigning as president, he took another even more rewarded retirement, which this time didn't involve shooting tigers. He was buried with full honors in 1951. And in 2004 was voted the greatest Finn. Finland itself came out of its association with Nazi Germany remarkably unscathed. It remains proud of the Finns who served in German uniforms. Although most Finns would still rather forget the darker moments of Nazi collaboration. Few countries can claim their relationship with Nazi Germany was a success. Finland, however, is the exception. Even if it meant collaborating with some of the most vicious war criminals the world has ever seen. In July 1941, hundreds of Jewish men were marched to a secluded spot in the woods near Vilnius in Lithuania. Blindfolded, walking in single file, they reached a specially prepared pit where they were lined up and shot. This was just the beginning. Throughout the war, 100,000 people would be killed at Panari.
Dozens and dozens of people who tried to escape and were killed by dum-dum bullets who were hit in their heads, mothers holding children, and young couples embracing each other.
And the most shocking thing about it is that many of these Jews were shot not by Germans, but by their fellow Lithuanian countrymen. One of the dirtiest secrets of World War II is that right across the Baltic states, thousands of people actively supported the Nazis. They would form the Schutzmannschaft, so-called protection teams, death squads that were used to hunt down and kill hundreds of thousands of Jews.
The Germans had created almost what you might call a criminal clique, a blood pact. Throughout Eastern Europe, there were tens of thousands of people who had covered their hands with the blood of Jews and communists.
So what drove these men to hunt down and execute their neighbors? Were they forced into it by the Nazis? Did they do it for the money? Or were they simply vicious sadists with a thirst for killing Jews? This is the story of some of Hitler's most brutal collaborators. The collaborators of Lithuania and the Ukraine. June 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's armies invaded Russia on a huge 2,000-mile front. Panzers drove deep into Russian territory. From the air, the Luftwaffe pummeled any resistance. German infantry units followed the Panzer spearhead. Taken completely by surprise, the Red Army didn't stand a chance. "900,000 Soviet soldiers fell into German hands almost immediately. By the end of August, this figure reached 1.5 million. Many more mutinied and deserted. But as the Germans pushed onwards, in some countries, they were welcomed as liberators. Cheering crowds turned out to greet them in their thousands. The reception was especially warm in the north, in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia.
Toda a Estónia foi libertada do terror bolchevista e a população saúda entusiasticamente e com gratidão as tropas alemãs.
The reason the people were particularly glad to see the Germans was that they hated the Russians. A year before the Germans arrived, the Russians had captured Lithuania. As part of a secret deal struck between Hitler and Stalin in August 1939, the Red Army had invaded and occupied the Baltic states. What made this so terrible is that these countries had previously been ruled by Russia for 120 years. They had only broken free after World War I. After just 20 years of independence, the Russians had come back. Stalin then wreaked havoc on his Baltic subjects.
They were racial enemies of the Russians, if you like. They were a different race from the Russians. They had Western traditions. They always looked to the West. They were on the Baltic. They looked to nations like Sweden and Germany and Denmark, their near neighbours, and not to Russia. So I think he regarded them as a fifth column and as intrinsically enemies of Russians and indeed of Soviet communism.
The Russians deported or executed thousands of families, viewed as anti-Soviet elements. Many more would die in prison camps in Siberia. Desperate to rid themselves of the Russians, the Lithuanian nationalists formed into guerrilla groups and prepared to rise against the Soviets. Little wonder that Hitler was seen as a better prospect than Stalin. For the Nazis, this was the perfect climate for recruiting collaborators. In the south, in the Ukraine, it was a similar picture. The Ukraine had once been one of the wealthiest parts of Russia, based on its fertile farmland. But all that had changed under Stalin. In the 1930s, he imposed a harsh new policy upon the Ukrainian peasants. They were forced to give up the land they had owned for generations and move to large collective farms. If farmers refused, they were made to hand over huge quotas of food to the state. Their homes were searched and destroyed by the Soviets, their food and equipment confiscated. The rural population was left isolated and starving. The result was a famine of biblical proportions. As many as 5 million Ukrainians died. The Ukrainians call it murder by hunger, a genocide perpetrated by Stalin, with the sole aim of wiping out their culture and killing as many Ukrainians as possible. No wonder they saw the Germans as a more attractive proposition. All this ensured that when the Germans arrived, they were greeted as liberators. But for Hitler, these adoring people presented a problem. He now had vast new territories to run and some 40 million more people to control. What was worse was that he despised every one of them.
He regarded them as a vast mass of slaves who were going to be used by the German settlers who he planned to plant on farms all over Poland, Russia, the Ukraine, and the eastern marches generally. They were going to be the slaves, the helots, mainly used as agricultural labourers. They weren't to be educated, but they weren't to be physically exterminated in a deliberate way, as he planned to do with the Jews, but they were going to be used more or less as a population, expendable population of slaves.
On top of this, these newly captured territories contained millions of undesirables, Jews, gypsies, and Russian prisoners. Controlling all of this would take a huge effort. The trouble was, Hitler just didn't have enough men. He couldn't spare any of his soldiers for police work because they were committed to the front. So the Germans had no choice but to turn to their despised new subjects for help. And they came flooding in. Many men were recruited from the ranks of anti-Soviet guerrilla movements in Estonia and Lithuania, or from Red Army deserters in the Ukraine. This call to arms happened within days of occupation. Their first official task was to deal with local communist organizations. Those who had experienced Stalinist oppression were eager to help. But this anti-communism masked another, much more sinister Nazi plan: the total annihilation of the Jews of Eastern Europe.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Und zweitens, Sie wollten, Herr, kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
Hitler had made no secret of his loathing for the Jews. He regarded them as parasitic vermin who polluted the blood of the German people and deserved to be eradicated. But crucially, in his eyes, all Jews were communists. Eliminate one, and you got rid of the other.
He saw Judaism and Bolshevism as part and parcel of the same force, and it was his view that there was going to be a world struggle between the two ideologies, the two rival ideologies of National Socialism and Judeo-Bolshevism. So Barbarossa was always on the cards. It was just a question of when.
It wasn't hard to convince the Lithuanians to turn on the Jews. They had a long history of anti-Semitism and blamed them for the recent Soviet oppression.
We're talking about the land that is the land of the pogrom, and always was, dating right back to Tsarist rule before the communists ever took over. There was a very lively tradition of anti-Semitism, and vicious anti-Semitism at that, all over Eastern Europe. It was by no means unknown for Jews to be massacred and killed.
Lithuanian nationalists had been preparing anti-Jewish propaganda for months. On the outbreak of war, they declared,
The crucial day of reckoning for the Jews has come at last. Lithuania must be liberated not only from Asiatic Bolshevik slavery, but also from the Jewish yoke of long standing.
In fact, the Lithuanians were so enthusiastic that their own armed groups turned on the Jewish Bolshevik menace within hours of the invasion.
So-called partisans rose up as soon as the fighting started along the border to join with the Germans. They often rose up in cities before the Germans arrived, started firing on Soviet units, and part of their activity was inciting people to join them in an anti-Soviet uprising. And that anti-Soviet feeling was almost indistinguishable from anti-Semitic feeling.
One of these groups was called the Lithuanian National Labour Defence Battalion, or TDA. Its men identified by the white armbands they wore on their sleeves. These groups began murdering Jews in vicious pogroms on the streets. Most notorious were those carried out across the city of Kaunas. There, in June 1941, Jews were hunted down, humiliated, and murdered by their Lithuanian neighbours. Crowds gathered round to watch members of the local militia beat Jewish men to death. In the background, they played the national anthem. So who were these men prepared to carry out such atrocities? One member of the TDA was a young man named Antanas Getsevicius, later known as Antanas Gekas.
Antanas Gekas was a Lithuanian nationalist. He was born in Lithuania in comfortable circumstances. His parents were landowners. He'd gone to the military academy in Lithuania. He'd become a lieutenant in the Lithuanian Air Force. So he was very patriotic. He had military training, experience, but he was also an opportunist of the worst kind.
In June and July of 1941, Kekas's unit was largely responsible for rounding up and executing hundreds of Jews at a site known as Fort 7 on the outskirts of the city. This violence was encouraged and incited by the Nazis, who reported
how easy it was to convince the Lithuanian circles of the need for self-purging actions to achieve a complete elimination of the Jews from public life.
It was just a taste of things to come. Watching all this unfold was Heinrich Himmler. As head of the German secret police and the SS, he was the man to drive through Hitler's racial policies in the Soviet territories. Right from the start, Himmler realized the Lithuanians were people he could do business with. He ordered,
no steps will be taken to interfere with any purges that may be initiated by anti-communist or anti-Jewish elements in the newly occupied territories. On the contrary, these are to be secretly encouraged.
As the word secret shows, Himmler was careful to disassociate himself from the work of these Lithuanian thugs.
At the same time, every precaution must be taken to ensure that those who engage in self-defense actions are not subsequently able to plead that they were acting under orders or had been promised political protection.
Himmler found there was no shortage of willing and competent executioners. And what happened to the Jews in the Ukraine was even worse. In the first days of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans had swept into the Ukraine, hammering the cities of Odessa, Kiev, and Lvov. They captured huge swathes of Ukrainian territory and pushed back the Soviet army. In Lvov, the Germans made a gruesome discovery. Hundreds of people had been slaughtered in the city jail. They were Ukrainian nationalists, murdered by the retreating Russians. The nationalist groups blamed the Jews. Under the approving eye of the Nazis, they rounded up the city's Jews and forced them to remove the dead bodies. Then they wreaked their revenge.
Jews were driven into the streets from their homes, their businesses. They were hacked to pieces in the street, beaten to death, shot. Women were raped. The violence, the destruction was extraordinary. The Germans had encouraged it, they stood by and watched it, and they enjoyed it.
The Germans were so entertained by what they saw that they filmed it. When the pogrom was over, 5,000 Jews were dead. The violence was so extreme that the Nazi leadership became concerned. This angry rabble was one step away from turning into an uncontrollable mob. It was time to channel this anti-Semitism and apply some rigorous German discipline. Himmler announced that the anti-Soviet militias were to be disarmed and reformed into the Schutzmannschaft, or Schumer for short. It means protection team. These were auxiliary police battalions under the direct control of the Nazis. Many young men eagerly grabbed their chance. So what motivated them to join the ranks of the Germans? Some, like Antanas Gekas, transferred from armed Lithuanian units like the TDA. He wrote a letter to the local German commander dedicating himself to the military success of the Reich and the greater glory of Adolf Hitler. But despite this, he clearly wasn't a committed Nazi. During the Soviet occupation, Gekas had actually worked for the Russians.
In his mind, the obvious thing to do was to immediately offer his services to the Germans in the most obsequious way possible. I don't think Gekas was really very ideological. I think he was probably a patriotic Lithuanian. He certainly didn't like Jews, but I don't think that he was a follower of Adolf Hitler. He hadn't read Mein Kampf. He was above all an opportunist who wanted to save his own skin, and he used any kind of excuse for self-promotion.
There were many other reasons why collaborators signed up to the new battalions. For some it was a job, security, food and money for their families. Many would claim to be fighting for their country against Russia.
A lot of them believed that this was a patriotic job, working for the Germans in the security apparatus, which of course meant hunting down, suppressing communist Jews who they regarded as their enemy. This was respectable work for someone who was a nationalist and a patriot.
But the Germans weren't too picky about the people they enrolled, and the auxiliary units also attracted criminal elements and opportunists.
Membership in these units was quite fluid. The pay and conditions were not exactly highly regulated. A lot of Lithuanians joined the Schutzmannschaft in the early period because they knew it would give them an opportunity to rob and to plunder, particularly the property, the homes of Jews.
Across the occupied countries, volunteers and conscripts flooded in. Estonia would eventually provide some 9,000 men. 5,000 Lithuanians would sign up. and the Nazis had a specific role in mind for their new recruits. The Schumer would be used alongside the most brutal of Nazi units, the Einsatzgruppen. These Einsatzgruppen were Special Operations SS units, and they took their orders from Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich. Their job was to follow the German army into occupied countries and murder communists, undesirables, and especially Jews.
They would go to a village or a town. They'd make contact with sympathetic elements, anti-Soviet nationalists, and ask them, where are the communists living? Where are the people who used to work for the Soviets? Are there any stay-behind Red Army soldiers? Where are the Jews? They would then target these groups, round them up, march them out of town or to the edge of a city to places where there were anti-tank ditches or ravines, and murder them.
The Einsatzgruppen had already done this grisly work in Poland. There, they murdered an estimated 50,000 people. But it became apparent that the Germans didn't have the stomach for the slaughter. Morale began to sag. So, in the Soviet territories, Himmler needed someone else to do his dirty work, and the Schutzmannschaft seemed ideal. The Lithuanian Schumer, including Gekas's battalion, joined the death squads of Einsatzgruppe A, led by the fiercely ambitious Brigade Führer Dr. Walter Strahlecker. His squad operated in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Of the 4 Einsatzgruppe units, his were the most murderous. Throughout the rest of the war, they would round up and execute Jews. For a short time, they stuck to men, but their policy of murder soon spread to women and children. Entire communities would be wiped out, herded into pits, and shot. Extraordinarily, local people far outnumbered Germans in these death squads.
Once the Nazi leadership had decided that it was going to cleanse the occupied territories of all Jews except those who were useful to their war effort, they absolutely had to have local collaboration. They needed local collaborators to show them where the Jews were, to guard ghettos, to march Jews out to the killing sites, to guard the killing sites, to shoot the Jews. They needed tens of thousands of local volunteers to carry out what was becoming a genocide on a vast and to us unimaginable scale.
The Schumer's first mass execution sites in the Soviet territories were in Kaunas, in Lithuania. Between June and October 1941, in a series of forts around the city, they perfected their deadly skills. They were led by Major Antanas Impulevicius, a former member of the Lithuanian militia and a notorious sadist. From Kaunas, the death squads fanned out across Einsatzgruppe A's territory, dividing into smaller units. One group was led by SS Standartenführer Karl Jäger. He kept a chilling, meticulous account of the Jews and undesirables murdered by his men. It became known as the Jäger Report. Across Lithuania, the numbers racked up. Until in December 1941, his unit had killed over 137,000 Jews. In cold, efficient detail, men, women, and children were recorded separately. At the end of the report, Jäger summarized.
I can now state that the aim of solving the Jewish problem for Lithuania has been achieved. There are no more Jews in Lithuania apart from the work Jews and their families.
What the report also detailed was the integral part played by the Lithuanian auxiliaries in this liquidation process. One of the most notorious massacres carried out by Jaeger's men was the liquidation of the Jews of the Vilnius ghetto in Lithuania. Jews were routinely rounded up and marched to the nearby woods of Panari by armed Lithuanian guards. In these woods, the Soviets had built huge pits for the storage of tank fuel. They had never been used for this purpose, but they were just right for what the death squads had in mind. Between July and December 1941, at least 48,000 Jews were lined up by the edge of these pits and shot. One teenager escaped from the Vilnius ghetto and witnessed what happened.
They took us in to collect bodies of dozens and dozens of people who tried to escape and were killed. Were killed by dum-dum bullets and collecting elderly people who were hit in their heads and see what's happening and see children, mothers holding children, and young couples embracing each other, and you take all these people and throw them into the pit. These were things you can't forget.
Day after day, the Lithuanian shooters executed their countrymen. How could they have done it? One motivation was money. These murder expeditions were also a chance to rob the homes and steal the property of the Jews. One Schumer unit was employed further afield, in the neighboring territory of Belarus, and it was developing quite a reputation. This was the death squad that Antanas Gekas had joined, the 12th Lithuanian Battalion. In September 1941, they were sent on a special operation in and around Minsk. Their task was the complete eradication of Jews from the ghetto and surrounding towns.
The Germans were very clever in the way that they deployed the Schutzmannschaften. They sent Ukrainians to Poland, they sent Lithuanians to Belarus. They used them in areas where they would feel no kind of local ties, no local allegiances. Very often there were linguistic barriers. So they were virtually mercenaries. They could be sent to an area detailed to carry out a killing operation without any sense of affiliation or affinity to the local people.
The 12th Battalion's crowning achievement came in a town called Slutsk. Here, as part of a German police battalion, they swept through the streets, rounding up Jews. They tore screaming children from their mothers and shot all who tried to evade capture. They then herded the Jews to pits outside the city. One of Gekas's officers described the massacres that followed.
We were driving the Jews to the pits. They went in rows of 4 persons, in long columns. One part of the guards were driving them, and the others were waiting to shoot. The victims were lying in pits and then were shot. We were killing with Russian rifles. We shot first their parents and then their children. It was terrible to kill. We did it automatically, without thinking.
As a platoon commander, Antanas Gekas took a prominent role in these operations.
He knew German. He was able to liaise between the officers and the Lithuanian rank and file. Gekas was involved in the entire process, in deploying the Lithuanians as guards, as shooters, as communicating with the German senior officers, and in the shooting, personally taking part in the killing of Jewish men, women, and children at the death pits.
In Minsk, Gekas and his battalion also took part in a macabre public spectacle: the hanging of 17-year-old Masha Broskina and her fellow resistance fighters. In Belarus, Gekas's battalion would participate in the murder of 300,000 people. Walter Stahlecker neatly summarized the killings in a special document. It's known as the Coffin Map. The map details the total number of people killed by Stahlecker's men and their auxiliaries, and declares Estonia to have been completely cleared of Jews. After this initial wave of killings, he reports 128,000 Jews remaining, presumably Jews who could be used for the German war effort. Meanwhile, in the Ukraine, Nazi collaborators were carrying out an equally ruthless extermination of the Jews. They operated within the Einsatzgruppe of Friedrich Jeckeln, SS and police commander in eastern Russia. Jeckeln's murder squads swept through the countryside and the death toll mounted. 2,500 Jews at Kryvyi Rih, 23,600 at Kamianets-Podilsky. And in September 1941, they helped to carry out the largest single mass killing by Nazis and their collaborators throughout the entire Soviet campaign. A convenient pretext for this extermination fell into the Nazis' lap. The Germans' headquarters in Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, were blown up by the retreating Soviets. The Germans pinned the sabotage on the Jews. They were rounded up by Ukrainian police and marched to a huge ravine called Babi Yar. It was the ideal place to try out one of Friedrich Jeckeln's most notorious techniques, known as sardine packing. Victims were forced to climb into the ravine by Ukrainian militiamen and shot from above. Another batch of Jews were ordered to climb down and position themselves, head to foot, with the dead. Then they, too, would be shot.
Yettel believed this was a more efficient way of killing Jews. It was also a more efficient way of filling the pits. You used the space more efficiently, so you didn't have to dig longer and bigger pits. In his eyes, this was a terrific achievement, a great step forward in efficiency. To us, of course, it is simply the most extraordinary barbarity. And you do wonder how an intelligent and educated man, which is what he was, could have thought this through and sort of patted himself on the back for having come up with this solution to a difficult problem.
Sardine packing proved very effective. After just 2 days, nearly 34,000 were dead. How could these people execute entire families? How could they justify killing women, children, babies? The hardcore Nazis, of course, viewed the Jews as a racial enemy that had to be exterminated. And as the next generation, children above all had to be wiped out. But what about the Nazis' Ukrainian collaborators? How could they do it?
Many of these people had a primitive way of thinking. They believed in blood feuds, grudges. They had long memories within their own communities. And I think they worried that if anyone in a Jewish community survived, they would come back looking for revenge. They didn't want witnesses. They didn't want anyone who could say, he killed my mother or father. So even the children had to be killed because they could be witnesses.
Having shown themselves willing to assist in the wholesale slaughter of Jews, Hitler's collaborators would soon be implicated in the very worst of his crimes. The world's first industrialized genocide. Death camps were set up to receive trainloads of Jews from across the occupied countries. The Nazis needed staff to run these death factories efficiently, so they turned to their Ukrainian puppets. One of the most notorious was a man thought to be called Ivan Marchenko. He was recruited and trained by the SS at a prison camp called Travniki. From there he was sent to the notorious extermination camp Treblinka to work the gas chambers, where 3,000 Jews could be killed at one time. He was a vicious sadist and became known as Ivan the Terrible. Marchenko was almost certainly a former Soviet prisoner of war. The recruitment of these guards was officially voluntary, but many would claim that their only real alternative was deportation or death in a prisoner of war camp. But once employed, they excelled in tormenting their victims. Especially Ivan Marchenko. He liked to use a sword to drive Jewish women to their deaths in the gas chambers. In these camps, Marchenko and his Ukrainian colleagues could unload and kill an entire trainload of people in just 4 hours.
A spirit of corruption began to fill the guard units at these killing sites. They had a lot of money. They were buying booze. They were drunk a lot of the time. Some of them took Jewish women from the trains, kept them from the gas chambers for a few days, and used them as kind of sex slaves. These death camps were the most horrendous environments in which men became corrupt, depraved, violent, any moral inhibition eroded.
In Treblinka alone, Marchenko and his men helped to murder over 750,000 people. He was exceptionally evil, and in 1983, the Israeli courts thought they had got him. A Ukrainian named John Demyanyuk was arrested and accused of his crimes. But it turned out that Demyanyuk was not Ivan Marchenko of Treblinka, and he was released. But he was not off the hook yet. Today, in Munich, Demyanyuk stands accused of being a guard at another killing center in Poland, Sobibor. Millions of Jews continued to be processed by Ukrainian collaborators right up to the end of the war, even as the German army faced its destruction. In 1943, the tide finally turned, and the war began to go badly for the Germans. The Russian army was striking back. Victory followed victory. Stalingrad, a resounding success for the Russian army. At least 275,000 Germans were wiped out. Many of them froze to death over the bitter Russian winter. The Battle of Kursk, the biggest tank battle of World War II. 500,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or lost. The German army was running out of men. For Hitler, there was now no option. The Nazis, who considered Slavs and Eastern Europeans as barely human, would now have to rely on them.
They were able to take advantage of this very successful Soviet counterattack to say to the peoples of Eastern Europe, unless you rally to our cause, the Bolsheviks are going to come back. And after this period of collaboration with us, after you've profited from looting the Jews, the killing of the Jews, they're not going to look very kindly on you. So if you want to defend your ill-gotten gains, if you want to defend any chance of Ukrainian independence or Lithuanian autonomy, join the German military forces.
The collaborationist police battalions were phased out. Their men transformed into frontline soldiers, fighting for the Germans all over the Eastern Front. Even the elite SS was forced to recruit from the Soviet states. 13,000 men formed an Estonian legion. Himmler even agreed to the recruitment of a Ukrainian SS division. But he obliterated any claims they could make to be patriots, fighting for their own country. They were not allowed to use the word Ukraine in the name of their unit. So in April 1943, they were formed into the SS Galicia division. 15,000 Ukrainian volunteers were signed up and sent to the Eastern Front. And when the Lithuanian police battalions were disbanded, Antanas Gekas joined a Luftwaffe labor unit and served on the Italian front. These collaborators were now a vital part of Germany's armed forces and fought by their side to the bitter end.
The Germans had created almost what you might call a criminal clique, a blood pact. Throughout Eastern Europe, there were tens of thousands of people who had covered their hands with the blood of Jews and communists, who had profited from the German occupation, and the Germans knew that they could rely on these people for a last-ditch defense of the occupation.
These collaborators, brutalized by years of killing and lawlessness, were now fighting for their lives against a Russian army hell-bent on revenge. But it was all too little too late. The Russians were coming, and there was nothing the German army or its collaborators could do to stop it. As the war ended, many former Schumer volunteers surrendered to American and British troops and escaped to the West. And there was good reason to run. Many who stayed behind after the war were hunted down by partisans seeking revenge. One of these partisans was Mannerheim, the Jewish teenager who had escaped the Vilnius ghetto. He was part of a group who tried to track down the perpetrators of the massacres at Panari. But a great many more escaped justice. Among these was the commander of the 12th Battalion, Antanas Mussert. He lived in America until his death and was never tried or punished for his crimes. And what of his one-time platoon commander, Antanas Gekas? Incredibly, he had changed sides right at the end of the war and fought for the Allies.
He took part in the fighting for Bologna in the last months of the Second World War, actually got a medal from the British, and was able to settle in Britain after the war with the men of the Polish divisions who, because they had fought under the British flag, were given the right to settle in Britain. He moved to Scotland and led an apparently blameless life until information was provided by the Soviets that revealed that he'd taken part in some of the worst atrocities of the Second World War.
In 2001, Scotland agreed to extradite Gekas to Lithuania, but he died before he could be brought to trial. After the Second World War, these Lithuanian and Ukrainian collaborators proved frustratingly hard to bring to justice. As a result, it's difficult for us to understand their motives. It's clear that some were anti-communists and were haunted by the atrocities committed on their friends and families by Stalin. Others had no choice. The Germans offered their best hope of survival, food and money for their families. But this cannot justify participating in the mass slaughter of millions of people. Many of these collaborators weren't just following orders. They killed for personal gain, and sometimes they enjoyed it. And their help ensured that Hitler could carry out his genocide against the Jews.